So like you said, when we talk about online learning services, so just a quick question for everybody here. Who here uses online services or has used them for CE credits at some point? Who hasn't? Everybody, who hasn't, put your hands up. Okay, so most people have. Just as a little bit of background, about 50% of the membership claims, of the AEPM membership, claims to use online learning services for CE credits. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So before I begin, I'll give you a little background on why we're doing this talk. So, online learning services is run by the Online Learning Services Subcommittee, who meets once a year at the AEPM annual meeting, as well as teleconferences, things like that. One thing that came up at this year's meeting was, should we reach out to the AEPM membership in general, just to make sure that people understand, oh, can everybody hear me?
I'm surprised that I'm going to say this, but you may actually have to talk a little bit louder.
Who can't hear me?
I'm having
Good.
Okay.
I was getting all kinds of signals there. All right. So one of the things that came up was, do we need to reach out to ensure that the AEPM membership knows what services we provide? And one suggestion was, well, maybe we can talk to at the checker meetings. The idea is we'll put together kind of like a canned presentation that can be given at any of the chapter meetings. We have members from many chapters, if not all the chapters, and we can kind of pass it around once it gets vetted and things like that. Now, that had been discussed, nothing had been put together, and then about a month ago I was like, hey, you want to give a presentation at the Rocky Mountain chapter meeting? At the same time, there was this push to give this presentation. So what you guys are going to see is the prototype version. There is no vetting, other than running it past like one or two people, a few concepts. So this is not the officially approved presentation, though it may eventually become that. So feel privileged, because you are. So, what do I want you to take away? One, I want you to know what we provide. So, what can you go to, if you go to the Online Learning Center, what is available to you, both in terms of continuing education credits, and just knowledge, whatever we have, you know what I mean? And we're going to spend some time talking about the process by which the quizzes you take when you try to get CE credits are produced. How those things are written, how they're reviewed, things like that. Because it turns out that a lot of people, even people who have participated in the process, aren't really familiar with that structure. And it may clarify things for people who have either been frustrated with online learning services or have tried to submit quizzes in the past and don't understand what's going on, or may have some interest in it in the future. So we'll kind of go through. Okay, so I want to introduce online learning services. This is just like the basic AEPM structure for our subcommittee. You know, the board of directors, people are mostly familiar that we have several different councils. There's educational council, professional science council, things like that. Below that, there's continuing professional development, and then there's online learning services subcommittee. So they are the people I'm representing today. Now, just to add a little bit of confusion, if you look on the AEPM website, the Online Learning Services Subcommittee should be, and is occasionally abbreviated, OLSS. Makes sense, right? However, at one point in our history, it was referred to as Remotely Directed Continuing Education. If you go to the CAMPEP website, they refer to programs such as this as Remotely Directed Continuing Education. The problem with this is, as I understand from talking with the people who operate the AEPM website, they do not want to change our abbreviation for our name. So even though that is our name, this is the abbreviation, and if you change it, it'll screw up a bunch of links in the website. So if you see RDCE, it is actually that. Okay? Doesn't really matter, but it's good to explain, because I know when I first started looking at it and participating, I'm like, wait a minute, this isn't even our subcommittee. I'm like, no, actually, that's us. So it's a good thing. Okay. So what I have posted here is the charge. I don't want to need you to read this whole thing. Obviously, any subcommittee, task group, anything like that on AEPM has some official charge. We're just going to talk and hit the main points. One, oversight of continuing education. Well, that's pretty vague. We're going to coordinate the continuing education quizzes. That's a little bit more involved, and again, a large portion of this talk will be about that. They also maintain the self-assessment modules, so if you have seen a SAMS talk at an annual meeting, you should know that that material is also available to you after those meetings on our site. And the last, maybe one of the biggest things I'll talk about is management of the virtual library, which is more complex than you might think it is. So the AEPM virtual library is this, essentially a conglomerate of presentations that have been given over a number of years. And we'll talk a little bit about what the future of that might look like. Okay, so why should any of you care about this at all? Well, most of us in here need continuing education credits for something. Either you need them because you're ADR certified, maybe you're providing certain types of, again, I feel bad for our therapy people because there's going to be a lot of imaging examples because that's what I'm familiar with, but just stay with me here. As an example, you do mammo, you need mammo-specific credits, right? All of these things can be obtained through the Online Learning Center. So it's very valuable. If you can't go to a meeting, right, where a lot of us, if you do go, get all your credits, or you get them all in a huge bolus, you could get them through these services. Okay, so what's it? The virtual library. Like I said, it's a repository for presentations. There's video and audio slides. It's free to all AAPM members. So if you are a member, student member, whatever, you can look at the virtual library presentations. Now, in general, I would not describe the virtual library as extremely searchable, but it does have some search function, and it is fairly useful. You could search by title, the presenter. If you have a topic you're looking for, it can be more challenging. One of the things that might help is, so there's these tabs across the bottom. As a heads up, when I was putting this presentation together, the website was having some trouble, so everything here is screen caps. We're not actually going through the actual website, which I had considered, but I was concerned that we might run into some problems during that. So you're going to see a bunch of screen captures I did. Okay, so that first tab says now available. Can anybody actually see that? Take my word for it if you can't see it. Virtual library presentations. Essentially what that gives you is a list of annual meetings, clinical meetings, other workshops, a number of things that you didn't realize AEPM has joint ventures with. So there's things with CRCPD, there's things with other organizations, ACR. All of these our members have given presentations at. Okay. If you go here, obviously at the top you can see 60th AEPM annual meeting. So if you click on that, you're going to get a huge list of presentations that were recorded during those meetings, talks, workshops, whatever. Okay. So this is one way to look for stuff. It's not exactly the easiest because, again, you may want to see something on a specific topic, in which case, using the limited search function is probably the best bet. Okay. There's a couple other tabs. The meeting tab is pretty straightforward. It just lists like AEPM specific meetings. It doesn't have all that extra stuff. But there's some other stuff in there. Now the question is it, what's its use? You'll see a list in there called Case of the Day. Has anybody looked at the AEPM Case of the Days ever before? Have you even heard of it? Who's ever even heard of it? She's heard of it. Tell us all about it. No. That's okay, I'll tell you. So this is something that nothing looks like it's been posted recently, but it's actually a pretty cool educational tool. So 2017 has a number of postings, and the previous years had a few postings. It's essentially you take some case where either it's an image quality problem or it's some question in the clinic or something like that. It's a short presentation with a few slides that usually is like, here's our problem, here's the physics behind what's going on, here is the resolution. It's a useful teaching point for things like residents, or if you yourself are interested in a specific topic. Again, it's not particularly searchable, and there's really not that much there. I don't know if they've posted, if they have anything planned for 2018. Again, 2018 is almost over. But they're actually useful, and had I known more about it, I might use this for students or something like that. They also have these Educator Day presentations. Again, this is something we haven't posted much on recently. It's primarily presentations on medical physics education. So if you have a particular interest in that, it may be worth looking at what's there. If you're looking for something that you're going to view a presentation and then get CE credits for, this may not be the best place to look. But again, there's other ways to go about that. The other thing that they have, which I thought was interesting, is that you can order aspects of the virtual library on USB. So you can get the virtual library in a non-virtual form. I don't know. And so it's an interesting idea. The idea is this. I want to have presentations available. I want people to be able to see it. I'm going to a place where I won't have internet access. Conceptually, I get that, though I can't imagine this happens very often relative for most of us. They also have an interesting little thing called Physicists of Note, which is more like, I don't know how to describe it in a way that isn't condescending or inappropriate, but there's a list of people who are well known in our community or have participated in our community for a long time, describing something about them. It's kind of biographical, not exactly. It's interesting, you can look at it, but again, it's not the meat and potatoes of what we do here with Oliver. Okay. So this slide is arguably one of the most important ones in the presentation because it highlights this thing. Has anybody seen this box recently? If you go and watch a presentation on the virtual library, this has appeared there. It's a rating system. Up until very recently, there was no rating system for virtual library presentations. The question is, why is it there? Now, before we go on, it's a rating system. It's 1 through 5, 5 being, hey, I thought that was a great presentation. 1 being, hey, that was a crummy presentation. 0 being, no one reviewed it. Okay? This is one of mine. Clearly, no one cared. But theoretically, someone might. So, why do we have this? Part of the problem here is that the virtual library content is huge. APM has looked at the cost in maintaining all of the content, making it readily accessible to everybody. Right? And essentially has decided that the subcommittee needs to determine some conditions by which we can remove material from the virtual library. Stuff that the idea is that things aren't going to be maintained for prosperity forever unless they are valuable. Now, how do we determine what's valuable? Well, there's some material, presentations on the current state of regulations that are no longer true. That's something that most of us could agree to some extent. We might want to remove that. We don't want anyone viewing something thinking it's true when it's not true. And you can imagine something scientific that turns out not to be true that was presented that we could then maybe remove. But in most cases, we just have a lot of presentations. Some presentations are both valuable, they're viewed a lot if they're attached to a quiz, which we can talk about in a bit, they're tested a lot, people use them, we want to keep those. Some things, like maybe the one I'm giving right now, no one cares, and they'll have to get rid of it. So, don't get me wrong, right now, this system isn't in place. No one is saying, okay, you've had this many reviews, it's bad, we're tossing it out. We don't know how to draw the line and say, here's what's going where. It hasn't been determined. Right now, they're just collecting data. But what I would encourage you to do is, if you do any of these, spend 30 seconds, think about it, and pick a number between 1 and 5, preferably based on your actual thoughts and not just random. Okay? Okay. So what's on the online continuing education tab? So like I said, there's virtual library, this, and this. Right now we have almost 500 educational activities. When I use the term educational activity, that is a combination of presentation or manuscript and quiz for continuing education credits, okay? Which is actually quite a bit. Now, it's spread out over a number of categories. We're going to talk about that. Like I said, most of you guys have taken one of these quizzes or at least a little bit familiar with. You view the presentation or occasionally read a manuscript if it's based on a reference or paper or something like that. And then you complete the quiz with 80% or greater, you get credits. Okay. Just as a heads up, this is not free to the AEPM membership. $75 annual fee. Most people pay it when they're doing their dues every year. $10 for junior members. Okay. That really looks bad. It was darker on my computer at home. But the whole point here is to highlight how many categories and quizzes there are. So this is broken down into 48 different categories. It could be anything. It could be a specific therapy task. It could be a specific thing in nuclear medicine, any different imaging modality, radiation protection, all of that. What I wanted to note here was there's a wide range in terms of how many quizzes are in each category. So these are the number of quizzes in that particular category. It's based on, of course, the frequency of talks in that category or publications, as well as the demand. Now, if you look here, you can't really see it that well. The category with the biggest demand for quizzes is mammography. Why? Because you have to have the mammo-specific credits. Okay? People make more of them. People give more talks on it as well. Okay? So there is that. And there are some categories in here that don't have very much. And if you have an idea about it, because we'll talk a little about that, about, hey, this would be good to have in the virtual library and as part of the continuing education. We'll talk about the mechanism for that. Okay. So SAMs. Everybody here's attended a SAMs talk at some point, right? The presenter prepared the talk, also prepared a set of questions. They submitted that set of questions 2 reviewers who reviewed it, they checked their references, and everyone agreed that the questions were good and that the answers were good and the reference was appropriate. Right? That's the idea with SAMS Talk. Well, these SAMS Talks are now being posted when you go to an annual meeting on this site. You can view it. You can also take a quiz that's a little bit shorter than the continuing education quizzes based on those talks. Okay? And those questions. So, what is really the difference? Well, first, let's talk about how this works. Again, you got to sign up for online CE if you want to get SAMS credit that way. Obviously, you can get credit if you go to the meeting and pay the attendant like that. With SAMS, you have to view the presentations before the quiz will pop up. You have to view the entirety of the presentation, and most SAMS sessions are something like this. It's a 2-hour session. You've got 3 speakers. Each of them has their own presentation, and then a combination of questions, either spread out through the talks in the old days, or now a lot of them are just, they have them at the end and you just take them, right? The questions will not pop up until you've viewed all the talks in a single session, just so you know. So there's no way to shortcut this thing. I mean, turn it on and walk away and come back and take the quiz or something like that. You can do that. Do not do that. So, pardon me. Okay. The big difference is it's 100% 100% correct to actually get credit for this. You have to get every question right. Okay. So it's a little different. And if you don't get it right, you can't take it again for 24 hours. Okay. So a little different. Looks a little bit like this. So if I go to the 2018 APM annual meeting under the SAMS tab, click it, it's just going to list every SAMS session that we did during the annual meeting. And you can easily say, hey, I want this one. And it'll go ahead and list the presentations, and you can go ahead and begin. So it's pretty easy to use. Does take time. This is not all of them, and it's all I can fit on the tab. There's more. Okay, so what is the big difference? Well, one, the self-assessment quizzes are submitted by the presenters, like I said. They're based on the questions that they provide. Fundamentally different than the other stuff on the Online Learning Center, where the quizzes are submitted by writers, and we'll describe that whole process in a bit. Like I said, there's a difference between the percentage you need to get it right. The other thing is, like again, SAMs are always tied to a presentation at a meeting that was identified as a SAM session. For the other online learning stuff, you can tie it to other presentations that AEPM can have record of. You can also tie it to manuscripts, and I've done this in the past where there's a paper. Hey, this is a good paper and it's interesting. It would be useful for there to be a quiz on this material and people to be able to get credit for it. And that's exactly what we can do. And we'll talk about how that kind of goes down. So now we've gone through, here's what it is, here's what we do. What is the process? And this is what the majority of the work of that subcommittee actually does. I know, no, just rip off the veil. So first, before we do that, what is the purpose of the quiz? Why do we have the quiz? This is important if you ever write one. Because, especially if you talk to some people who have been writing quizzes for a long, long time, there has been a bit of a shift in terms of, maybe the term is quality, but approach to quiz writing. For the better. So we'll talk about that, we'll talk about the process, and we'll talk about writing a good question if we have time. Okay, so what's the purpose of the quiz? This comes straight from the Camp website, who gives us our credit. And all that I want you to take away is this underlined statement here. The quiz is designed to test the participants' understanding of the subject matter. It is not to just verify that they viewed the presentation. That's important, because there are a number of quiz writers and people taking quizzes who do not care about number one, or have emphasized, no, we're just verifying that they went through it. So we make sure that we spread out questions throughout the whole presentation. They take it, great. And I definitely butted heads with a few quiz writers on this issue, because they're not trying to test understanding of the subject matter. So that's what the quiz is about. Okay, so who's involved in quiz writing? Well, obviously the writer themselves. This is a person who is ideally the presenter of this. In many cases, this is the case. So a person gives a presentation at AEPM. After the annual meeting, the AEPM staff who work for the subcommittee usually will go ahead and send out requests like, hey, you gave this presentation, would you be interested in preparing a quiz to be part of our educational materials on the website? That's kind of like the most common mode and number one, like what we'd like to have. There's other options though. Sometimes there's a material that we think is valuable, but the author of the presenter was just like, I don't want to be involved, or I don't have time to work on this. In that case, either members of the subcommittee themselves can recommend, hey, I know so-and-so, they're an expert in blank. Why don't we reach out and see if they're interested in writing a quiz? Sometimes it's one of the members of the subcommittee themselves. In the case, I had one where someone said, hey, write a quiz. And I'm like, oh, hey, I'm actually working on that, so I'll write a quiz on that. So that happens. But like you said, there's another option. The other option is you have been doing whatever you are doing. Somebody in the membership is working on something, they read a manuscript, maybe a new publication on something interesting or very impactful, said, hey, it would be useful for people to know about this. They can always send an email to here, which is also on our website, and say, I think there should be a quiz. Here is the reference. I would like to write a quiz on this. And 9 times out of 10, we're going to say, great, we'll send you some guidelines. Please attempt to write a quiz. And we'll talk about how that process happens. Now, who else is involved? The review. So, for every category, you saw that huge list of categories, we have a number of reviewers that are kind of spread out, and so I might be a reviewer for 5 categories or 10 categories, but not all of them because I'm not an expert or knowledgeable in all those categories. We may have somebody who is, I'm a specialist. I'll use the mammo example again because it's come up so much. Specialist does tons of mammo, has been involved for forever. Someone's going to write a quiz on mammo. We're going to put a reviewer who knows mammography very well. This person has a number of responsibilities. One, they're going to look at what gets submitted as the quiz in terms of the answers, the objectives, how the questions are, everything like that. And ensure that things like the answers are actually related to the presentation, aren't something that somebody would just know or get from somewhere else, that the questions are written appropriately, that the answers are indeed correct, that there's only one correct answer, which is a big one. Things like that. We'll talk a lot about question writing at the end. Some of those are pretty fun. Okay. So the reviewer goes through this. There's also an administrative reviewer. We'll talk a little bit about their role in a second. And the AAPM staff who facilitate the entire process, without which we couldn't actually do any of this. Okay. So this is a simple flowchart for how this all works. It's a little busy, but don't pay too much attention to this. Just know that say somebody says, I'm going to write a quiz. We send them saying, here are the guidelines for how to write a quiz, right? Actually, let me go back one. No. The guidelines for writing a quiz are primarily based on the ABR question writing guidelines. So if you've written questions for the ABR, for any of the exams or anything like that, you know there are certain expectations of how you write a good question. Those are our current accepted guidelines. They have not always been that case, and you'll find in older quizzes that things definitely deviated from that standard. And I will argue quiz writers who have been doing so for a while do not seem to want to adjust to the new expectations. Okay, but they write a quiz. It gets submitted to the quiz reviewer. Now, if they have corrections, if they're minor corrections, the reviewer themselves can change them. You're like, oh, you know what, you said the right answer was A, but it's actually D. That's it, we can fix that, we don't have to send it back. But we might have to send it back to the writer if some of the questions are just completely wrong, unrelated to the presentation, don't serve the objectives. And this is the big part where once it gets past the reviewer, then we go down to this administrative reviewer. That is a major part of the administrative reviewer's role. One, a lot of times the reviewer will get so hung up in the material, and they're focusing on cleaning this up, making sure everything is presented right, that when it gets, and then they say, okay, that's pretty good, and they let it through. The admin reviewer, of which there are a smaller number within the subcommittee, that say, wait a minute. Yes, it's a question that's written well. Yes, it is mentioned in the presentation, but does it serve the objectives of the quiz? Does it test understanding? Good example. I had a quiz written recently where one of the questions that had gotten through the reviewer was, what is the number of the task group discussed by the presenter? And I said, no, you got to kick that back. We cannot have that because it doesn't test anything. You don't know anything. And the writer actually sent something directly back to me saying, it's important to know the numbers of the task groups. And I said, nope, it's not important enough. That was bad and you should feel bad. And so we eventually got it sorted out. But it was really, that is their role. Okay. Eventually, the admin reviewer is the person who says, hey, I think this is ready to publish. So what does the quiz writer need actually? One, they have to prepare learning objectives for the quiz. These are usually based on the learning objectives posted by the presenter themselves. Normally when you, especially if you do a CM session, you always have learning objectives, but a lot of people who prepare a talk like this one have some objectives. Here's what I want you to take away. A lot of times we'll just say, hey, we want you to take that from that's what we're testing in the quiz. They need to submit 10 multiple choice questions, 3 to 5 answers. Now, strictly speaking, you can get away with more than 5 answers, though we rarely do that. And we strongly discourage any true false or obviously less than 3. And there's some good reasons for that. Here's the question right again that I was talking about. Okay, now I might have a quiz that gets published and the community starts taking the quiz and and it allows for feedback. So you can comment on any quiz you've taken and say, hey, by the way, the answer to number 3 is actually D, not B. And I see that and I say, okay, well, we'll think about that. And then 20 other people take the quiz and say, hey, the answer to number 3 is D, not B. We can revise based on that. And that process is always ongoing. We're always doing that. We won't revise a quiz based on a single comment. Or a number of comments that aren't in the same direction. So we've had some, I had a quiz that I had actually written before I was a reviewer, that there was a comment on there that I had required someone to do a basic calculation. Many of these questions require arithmetic. Not anything complex, you're not doing calculus or anything like that, but you should be ready to add, subtract, multiply, or divide at any time. And the response that somebody made, or the comment they had made on that question was, well, this might be appropriate for somebody's qualifying exam, but clearly not for the online learning services. No one took that guy seriously. Because no one else made that comment, right? If everyone had commented, this is too hard, this is too much, then we would consider revising. But it was one person. So that process is in place. We get comments all the time. Sometimes you get comments like this up here, which is not all that useful, like great overview of this topic. Not particularly useful, but does feel good. But a lot of times it's more like this. Hey, this is incorrect, or none of these are correct, or I don't think that this was important to the topic, or something like this, which is, why was my answer wrong? Those ones are sometimes hard because we don't necessarily always respond directly to that person and say, your answer was wrong because of blank. But that might clue us in if a number of people are saying there's something going on here. It's not uncommon to write a question with 4 answers where really more than one of them could potentially be correct. And so we're always looking to try to correct that. Okay. So the rest of this talk is about writing a good question. Do I have time to continue talking, or am I have I gone over?
Okay.
You good? Okay, great. So we'll talk a little bit about it. So if you're not familiar with the general language we use to describe a question that we're writing, when we write a multiple choice question, a lot of times the question part itself is referred to as the stem. Is everybody familiar with that? Has heard that before? Yes? No? Raise your hand if the answer is no. Okay, so some people know that. Very good. Okay, obviously the idea is we have one answer, and 4 alternate responses are distractors. These are answers that are not the correct answer. And the idea is, if I want to test how well someone knows a subject or a concept especially, how you do each of these parts is really important. So I've got some question writing tips written here that we'll kind of briefly touch on, and then we'll go to some examples. So obviously we avoid true-false questions. Why do we avoid true-false questions? Well, one, 50% of people are going to get them right if they just guess. But the real reason is it's hard to write a true-false question that really tests a concept and makes it clear that this person really understands, unless the concept is very simple. So we try to avoid something that's clearly binary, right? Because good test takers can figure those out without knowing. We do the 3 to 5 responses for the same reason. What else? We try to avoid using all of the above, or both A and D, or this thing. Why do we try to avoid that? Because at this point in your education or career, every one of us has taken 100 multiple choice tests and has demonstrated the ability to be good test takers and select the correct answer without knowing anything about the topic at all, because we're good at taking the test, right? These questions Make that easier. So we try to avoid these sort of things. Okay? Try to ask a complete question. We'll talk about what that really means. It's basically avoiding filling in the blank. The cover test we're going to talk about in a second. Avoid using negatives. All these we're going to talk about in a second. We'll focus on the last one. Like I said, I hit it several times. Focus that they understand something. That what the question you ask serves an objective, demonstrates that they understood something important about what was presented. So, asking a complete question. Obviously, it's an example of fill in the blank. This is pretty straightforward. We want you to ask what would be a normal complete sentence. Like, what? Well, it's right here. Okay. Ask in complete sentences a question that then the person could then answer. Okay. Cover test. This one's more interesting and very important because a lot of people miss this. It's the idea that if I read a question, I should have a pretty good idea what the answer is without knowing what any of the answers are. Like, without looking at any of those down there, I should know, okay, this is probably what they're referring to based on what I saw in the presentation. If I have no clue what it is until I look at the answers, that's a bad question. It makes it very difficult for us to test a particular concept if they don't even have a sense of whether, if even someone who knows the subject wouldn't know that answer before looking at the distractions I have. Okay. Avoid using negatives. So this is, according to TJ18, which of the following is not considered to be a secondary display? Double negatives are just confusing. Where there are people who will get things incorrect, not because they didn't know, but just because they get tied up in the words. That's pretty straightforward, right? Oh, how to write alternate responses, especially if it's quantitative. So, if we look at this example, it's interesting. We say, okay, what's the approximate dose to a fetus from a single phase adenoid pelvis CT exam of the mother? Well, if I make all the answers really close to a plausible answer, because here, none of this is specific to any real exam. It's which of these is the most plausible is what we're really asking. And if you understand what's typical, then you'll know what's plausible and what isn't, right? But in this case, I think there's a number of plausible answers. You know what I mean? Yeah, there might be one that's slightly more plausible. But you guys, that all makes sense, right? Okay, I got some confidence here. All right. Ultimate responses should be reasonable. To the example that I got here, I got this slide from Rebecca here. And this is a great example. You will see people do this all the time. And it's hard. Question writing is hard. They'll say, okay, I've got to come up with 3 to 5. In this case, it would have been better to just use 3 than to do what they did, which in this case is they made up a term. They made up a word and threw it in there. Making up a word, but it happens all the time where we just throw some goofball throwaway answer in there. Do not use throwaway answers. Throwaway answers do not test concepts. And you're no better off than you were just to get 4. And it does seem like there's a pathological need to have 4 answers. You don't have to have 4. But we are kind of driven to that. And it makes us do stuff like this, which doesn't do any good. If anything, all it does is distract a person from the actual test. There's no point in it. Okay. So we talked about online learning services. We talked about what services they provide. We talked about how quizzes are written. We talked about questions. What I want to know from all of you, and what I assume would be the biggest question after seeing this whole presentation is, how do I join? He's ready. No, the reality is this, we're always looking for people to participate. We always need question reviewers, people to do additional writing, people who want to be on the subcommittee. I understand that this material is dry. I've tried to keep it entertaining. But if anyone is interested, they can contact me, or obviously you can contact the subcommittee directly. So it's pretty much all I have, unless anyone has any questions.